Friends, welcome to Zealots at the Gate, a Comment original podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen. Send us an email with feedback, questions at zealots@comment.org, and make sure you tag us on social media. I'm Matthew Kamick.
And I'm Shadi Hamid. Matt and I are good friends, but maybe you wouldn't expect that. Matt's Christian, I'm Muslim. Matt's conservative, I'm sort of liberal. Matt's white, I'm brown. Also, Matt's a theologian, I'm a political scientist.
Together we research religion, politics, and the future of democracy at Georgetown University. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, we have a very special guest today, Dr. Omar Suleiman, who's probably one of the most important and influential American Muslim scholars. He's also the president of Yaqeen Institute, which is a nonprofit that pioneers Islamic research on different topics. Welcome, Omar. It's great to have you. Maybe just to get us started, I want to look at the last 25 years. Both of us came of age post 9/11. That was really a pivotal moment for us in terms of how we developed politically. I think at that time we thought post 9/11 was the worst time to be a Muslim in America. But now I think we're at a point where it might even be worse, but there might also be aspects that are better. We have, of course, the Gaza war. We had the 2024 election, which was divisive in the Muslim community. But we also have more Muslims who are in prominent public positions. We've become more mainstream in a lot of ways. So there's a number of different angles. Maybe just give us your broad overview of the state of the American Muslim community.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in on that real quick, because I think that's a really great way of framing it, Shadi. I mean, you do have prominent Muslims, growing up into political, business, technological leadership throughout the country. And so in many ways, it's the best of times. And yet you also have Republican congressmen saying Islam is incompatible with America and we want Muslims to leave. We want to deport them. And Shadi just recently, they've been saying he should go back home. Of course, Shadi was born here.
I wrote a controversial article that people were attacking me for, but I get that all the time. If you don't like something about America, leave. If you're criticizing X, Y, or Z. I think a lot of us as American Muslims get that.
Yeah. So how does this compare to the sort of post 9/11 experience today? How do you think about how those two different eras sort of compare to one another?
Yeah, I mean, 25 years in a couple minutes. I'll do my best. There are a lot of in-betweens, right? There are a lot of intervals. In fact, I can think about how every attack seemed to change the landscape. In fact, I would argue, this might sound crazy for people, but I'd argue that the worst time it felt like for American Muslims was probably after San Bernardino, because that's when, even though the attack was not on the scale of 9/11, you had the maturation of the Islamophobia industry, it felt like, and all the surveillance programs in place and securitizing of the Muslim community, coupled with the deep paranoia at that point of the Muslim community. And it was like, man, we just can't get out of this, right? So it felt like that was the peak for me personally. But I will kind of walk it back a bit. Firstly, thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you both. I grew up in Louisiana. I was born in New Orleans. And I grew up in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, in the Deep South, here in the United States. My father is a Palestinian refugee. My mother as well. My dad came here late 60s. Distinguished professor of chemistry, and was someone that used to debate and dialogue on Palestine, dialogue on faith. Growing up, I saw that. And so I really tried to encounter the world through his lens, if that makes sense, as to how, because he was in a role that I'm in today in many ways. And he validated everything that I felt, even though I was growing up in the 80s and the 90s as a kid, right? And was just coming in, out of high school when 9/11 happened. So pre 9/11, I would say there was deep curiosity about Islam. That doesn't mean that Muslims didn't encounter bigotry. They did, but they encountered bigotry more so on account of their race than their religion. And so if you were in the Deep South, like growing up, I would have encountered more racism for being perceived to be black because I look Creole. Everyone just assumed I was Creole growing up, than being Muslim. There was a very insightful comment from a prominent black Muslim leader that before 9/11, I felt like I was discriminated against more for being black. After 9/11, it was because of being Muslim. So it was the double whammy of, driving while black, flying while Muslim. Those two things come together and it becomes compounded bigotry. When 9/11 happens, that calculus switches. There was bigotry, there was racism, but it was mainly curiosity. And in fact, the Nation of Islam historically was looked at as the greater domestic threat, whereas Muslims abroad were, there was fetishizing, there was Orientalism, there were stereotypes, but it wasn't as much of a threat, unless America's foreign policy needed it to be so momentarily, right? With the Iran Revolution, the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, 9/11 happens and you go from curiosity to scrutiny, deep scrutiny. You have to prove yourself now. You have to prove that you're not a threat to America. Suddenly you go from being, the neighbor who has this culture that we can't quite understand, but it's interesting, to, are you plotting the next attack on American soil? And so Muslims come into this posture, this defensive posture of trying to push back against the scrutiny and say, we're not them. We were attacked on 9/11. Muslims were attacked, which is factual, by the way. Muslims were attacked on 9/11. There were multiple Muslim victims on 9/11. Some of them were very active in the Muslim community, especially in New York, which is one of the hubs of the American Muslim community. We feel this pain and we're disgusted by this attack. And we'll stand together, shoulder to shoulder, side by side, with our American, colleagues, with co-citizens, to push back on this evil that has come upon us. But at the same time, by the way, can you be a little bit, reflective about what America's foreign policy has been, what America has meant to the world? We're not justifying 9/11, which we were not, but maybe this is a time to think about, what America's foreign policy is like and how America is felt in the world, and why there could be a brewing anti-American sentiment that could lead to attacks like this. It's not justifying it, but, America, don't fall for, simplistic stereotypes like they hate us for our freedom, and then bring in your Hollywood understanding of the Muslim community, which is that these are backwards people that live in the desert. It's Aladdin and a genie, and here they are now, and they hate us for our way of life. There's something to think about here, about the role that America plays in the world around. But the posture of the American Muslim community was, we're not those people. We didn't attack America. We condemn, we condemn, we condemn. We have nothing to do with this. Now, the Islamophobia industry really takes advantage. In fact, it in many ways is born in the wake of 9/11. It becomes a multi-billion-dollar industry that takes advantage of the sudden curiosity about the Muslim world, primarily the Muslim world, not necessarily Muslims domestically. And so you have all of these, extremists, people that would not be taken seriously on most subjects about anybody, that suddenly are training government agencies, that are suddenly training newsrooms, that are suddenly trying to give context with their new think tanks about what the Muslim world is and what Islam actually is. And so that fear is now turning into policy. I think that Muslims went from being in a place of scrutiny and defending themselves to saying, we're sick of defending ourselves. At what point do we start speaking about fact, the amount of violence that happens domestically, not at the hands of Muslims, the amount of violence that the American government commits abroad? And when Gaza happens, I would call this the most critical juncture that I can think of after 9/11. Why? Because when we watch this genocide happen on our screens, and I'm not just talking about myself, I'm a Palestinian American Muslim, right? I'm saying it's probably especially pronounced for a Palestinian American Muslim or an Arab American Muslim, but I think any Muslim period, and to be honest, people of conscience, but let's just talk about the Muslim community. It was like, how dare you interrogate us about where we stand on violence, about what our intentions are, about what our faith allows us, about what our value system must be, when you are able to actively carry out a genocide on everyone's screens, for all of us to see. And it dawns upon us, I think, that if you're okay with us being carpet bombed and wiped out there, if we've been dehumanized to that point over there, then what are you capable of towards even your Muslim neighbors here? If you had the opportunity, would you do the exact same thing here? Because if you've dehumanized the people to say that it's okay for them to be wiped out that way, then that means that the end goal of your hate and your bigotry here is to wipe out Muslims here. And so every accusation is a confession, right? And so Muslims, I think, especially American-born Muslims, that don't feel the insecurity to challenge not just the American government, but the systems at play of dehumanization, that don't fear for their paperwork, that don't feel like they don't have equal participation in public discourse, are like, wait a minute, let's flip this a bit, because right now, this is not a time for us to be interrogated anymore about our humanity. Clearly, this is a time for you to be interrogated about your humanity and what you're capable of.
I think that's a really good point, that for so many of us, Gaza was not a foreign policy issue, is one that was felt very intimately, not just because it's the U.S. that enables Israel's actions in Gaza, but also because it was sort of reflected back on us that this was anti-Arab and anti-Muslim. The Israelis had no respect for Muslim life. And with the Biden administration supporting what Israel was doing, the Biden administration didn't value Muslim life either.
Right.
And I think that's why it felt so personal, because I often get this question, why is Gaza so important to you? And that's a longer conversation. But I think Gaza is a good entry point to talk a little bit more about the 2024 election, which was divisive in the American Muslim community. I remember the weeks leading up to it, where people who were supporting Kamala were angry at people who were going to vote third party and vice versa. And there was a lot at stake, obviously. And Dr. Omar, you were someone who called on American Muslims to withhold their vote for Kamala and to instead vote third party. You signed a letter to that effect along with other American Muslim scholars. I'm curious how you look back at that time and how you look back at that decision, because I think, knowing what we know now, the Trump administration 2.0 seems a lot worse than Trump 1.0. I would say for me, it's worse than even my worst nightmares. It's actually, I did not envision this happening, and maybe I'm naive about how bad Trump was about to become. But look, so I'm just curious, do you think that was still the right choice for American Muslims to vote third party? And what are your broader reflections on the divisiveness that we faced in the community around that vote?
Well, Shadi, before you put our guest on the spot like that, I'm going to put you on the spot, because you too were quite critical of Kamala Harris, and you too discussed not voting for her or voting for a third party. What would you say to that question before you corner our guest?
I'll get a sip of water while I take notes.
No, we just want to spice things up a little bit, have some contrast, you know. But I wasn't too far from you, Dr. Omar, in the sense that I was debating about what I would do until the very last moment. It was a game time decision for me. And there was a big part of me that really did not want to vote for Kamala Harris. But I think at the end of the day, the way that I saw it was, it's a lesser of two evils. They're not equivalent. They're both bad, but one is clearly worse than the other. And I also take seriously the Islamic injunction that we should reduce harm where possible. That if we can't get our ideal scenario, if we can't get what we really want, then we have to at least try to do whatever we can to make things less bad. But I totally respect the fact that many Muslims went in the other direction and decided to withhold their vote. And I don't take that personally.
And this is a question that, you know, over on the Christian side we have as well, for those of us who are pro-life on issues of abortion. I have many Christian friends who are like, I don't like Donald Trump. I think he is bad for this country in so many ways, but the Democrats are going to expand access to abortion. And so the lesser of two evils sort of argument. And so, yeah, I'm just wondering if you could sort of articulate where you were at that time. And as Shadi says, how do you feel about your choice now? And yeah.
I'd like to actually frame it in the previous discussion, if that's okay. When Gaza happened, I was in the middle of a protest when my phone started blowing up and said, Sheikh, we need you. Get on, please. We need to call you. I'm like, I'm about to give a talk. What's going on? Please. Something happened in Chicago. Ironically, I think the first person to text me was Salah Sarsour, who's in ICE detention now, an American Muslim community leader who's in ICE detention now. And it was about the young boy Wadir Fayoumi, the 6-year-old Palestinian kid who was stabbed over 20 times with a military knife to death. And his mom also stabbed multiple times but survived, his mother Hanan. My heart sunk. I actually went to Illinois. I participated in that janazah, in that funeral. I've kept in touch with Hanan since. I've been to Capitol Hill with her. And it felt like Gaza came home. Now, I'm making a point here which I hope resonates. Many of the people that refused to reach out in the initial weeks following the beginning of this genocide reached out and said, we're so sorry, and this is horrible and shouldn't happen. And my response was, and these are people that would be Democrats, liberals, many of the folks that in the interfaith community would have been progressive Christians, progressive rabbis, that would have reached out and said that, in the wake of any Islamophobic attack, this is horrible. My response was, what's the difference between Wadir Fayoumi and every single one of those children under the Israeli bombs that we're paying for in Gaza? And it was radio silence. No one would respond. No one would talk to me on that basic moral premise. We couldn't have a conversation. That to me represents the conundrum of why the liberal Democrat embrace of the American Muslim community failed and became inconsequential at that point. That there was a differentiation, that the only way that you would be included in a liberal democratic paradigm, and obviously there's a big difference between liberalism here in the broader sense in the Democratic Party, but I'm just talking about how the Muslim community was looking at the calls for inclusion that existed prior, the same people that would have showed up to the airport in Trump 1.0 against Muslim ban, and why it wasn't working anymore. It was that the limit of your calls to inclusivity, the limitation was that you only limited it to liberal Muslims who didn't care about foreign policy, Muslims that would be politically liberal and that wouldn't care about your the foreign policy that you were putting forth. To me, it's Islamophobia when you blow up a masjid in Gaza, when you blow up a masjid in America. I can't separate those two things. Maybe because I'm a Palestinian American and literally I got a Google News alert of one of the children that was killed named Omar Suleiman, who had my name. And that shook me to my core because it was like, if my parents didn't get out of Palestine, if I wasn't born here, it's sort of like that we didn't land on Plymouth Rock landed on us. When Malcolm said that, it's like, I could have easily been one of those children, right? So that to me represents how Gaza severed the ties in many ways. It's like, we cannot have this cognitive dissonance anymore. You can't, and you would hear Democratic politicians keep saying, Trump put forth a Muslim ban, it's like, you're actively participating in a genocide now that is trafficking in Islamophobia. How dare you talk about Trump's Muslim ban when you're banning Muslims from life, right? By bombing them to pieces. And Netanyahu is like the poster boy of Islamophobia right now. So, which brings us to 2024. I would put back, Shadi, I would say that, and I'm going to give a little bit of the internal discussion that I was having with many American Muslim leaders. I would say the first thing that I had to take into consideration was I wanted to make sure I held my community together. And so I took a strong stance personally against attacking other Muslims for how they were going to vote in this election. And so you would not find a single sermon, a single post from me, a single comment from me that in any way turned the blame towards American Muslims for whether they were going to vote third party or hold their nose, and hold their nose is the expression, right? Hold their nose and vote for Kamala, or even those that would vote for Donald Trump. As much as I abhorred that option. When there were imams that endorsed Trump, and they were not the representation of the American Muslim community, and the vast majority of imams did not take that position, but there were imams that did that, and I was told, call them out. I said, I'm not going to call them out. Instead, I'm going to, number one, try to hold our community together, because our community, it's not fair to come back to our community and put the onus on them with this impossible situation that they've been put in. Number two, direct your blame, direct your fire at the Democratic Party, which refused to make any movement towards actually earning the American Muslim vote or the vote of people of conscience by stopping this genocide. Joe Biden could have stopped this genocide. That's a fact. His own administration talks about this today. You know, members of administration, which are going to get book deals and speaking engagements all over, are going to talk about how we did not want this, but Joe Biden insisted on it, right? Kamala had an opportunity to distance herself from that genocide. She didn't. The Democratic Party could have made the overtures that were necessary to earn the Muslim vote. I truly do believe that. But I think they put us as American Muslim leaders as well in an impossible situation. Let's say, even if I wanted to, you know, our community, even if I wanted to, which I didn't, there would have been no way to galvanize an already disengaged and disillusioned American Muslim electorate to vote for Kamala Harris, just because of what we call the fitra, their natural disposition, their anger towards the genocide. There would have been no way. There were some institutions that were trying to do that. I say this respectfully and with love for everyone that I think it was tone deaf. It wasn't going to work. You can't keep ignoring the elephant in the room, which happens to be genocide. If this is the lesser of two evils, then you're not selling the lesser of two evils anymore very well. So I believe that there was no way that you could have galvanized the American Muslim vote for Kamala when the Democratic Party wouldn't even throw us a bone.
Yeah.
So even tokenizing the Palestinian vote at the DNC, they wouldn't even do that, right? So there was no way to actually galvanize. And so here's what I'd say. I'd say the protest vote was the best way to have a culmination of our energy, of our anger, and still get Muslims to the ballot box. Because if they didn't vote third party, the majority of Muslims were just not going to vote, period, in this election. Those that voted for Trump on the basis of other ideological leanings, maybe economic benefits. But that's kind of where my position is on this now.
Yeah. So one of the things Shadi and I talk about quite a bit is political exhaustion, political cynicism, political depression, political loneliness, all of these sorts of experiences. And, you know, it's not difficult to imagine that the American Muslim community is politically exhausted and hurt by all of these, you know, by the past few years. And so I'm curious, one of the things we think a little bit about is the practices of prayer and fasting and just spiritual development, not simply for our personal or our individual lives, but also for our public life and how we draw upon our faith for political resilience. And so I'm just curious, because you're not simply or even primarily a political leader, you're a spiritual leader, and you offer lots of advice and counsel and sermons on the spiritual well-being of Muslim Americans. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us just a little bit about what you see that intersection being for Muslim Americans as they think about political resilience or just cultural resilience within a culture that can be quite antagonistic towards their lives. What is the role of prayer? What is the role of reading and study and spiritual growth as you think about those things? Where do you draw from when you talk about those things?
That's a wonderful question. And I would say that the Muslim is taught, I imagine, not so much unlike what you would teach, that whatever happens to you, internalize that in a way that is productive, in a way that causes you to immediately go to, what does God want from me now? what does God want from me now? So to take your unique set of circumstances and to ask yourself individually and collectively, what's most pleasing to God in this situation? Building character is a win. Building resilience is a win. Building integrity, building principle is a win. And in many ways, I would say that the American Muslim community has built much of that in the wake of all of this. And I hope it will be a win, though the disillusionment is unfortunate. In some ways, I'm glad that there is a sense of urgency that exists now amongst American Muslims.
So if I could press you,
Yeah.
How is that resilience built, practically speaking?
Yeah.
What are the mechanisms or the techniques or what advice do you give for building that sort of resilience? How do you direct your people?
So certainly we anchor ourselves in the stories of the prophets and the story of the prophet, peace be upon them all. So the story of all the prophets and the Prophet Muhammad specifically, peace be upon them all, that we look to what they've been through. So you would hear the stories of Job, and you would hear the stories of Jonah, and you would hear the stories of Jesus and Moses and Abraham, and how lonely Abraham felt in the fire, and how lonely the Prophet Muhammad felt in the trench, and how lonely, Moses must have felt as he was right in front of the sea, about to part the sea. May God's peace and blessings be upon them all. So we anchor ourselves in the stories of the prophets and what they went through. And that moment in the Quran that always seems to come, which is, with every hardship comes ease. That's the verse that, there is light at the end of the tunnel, and there's actually ease with the hardship. It's not after the hardship comes ease. There's something that God is giving you right now that you can lean into and you can grow. So practically, there's definitely a whole lot of prayer, and there's a lot of return to faith and return to what stabilizes you and makes you certain in an uncertain and unstable world. And so you would see mosque attendance go up in the last few years. It hasn't gone down. You would see return to faith go up. People have leaned back on their faith. I've seen many people that I would have never imagined to be practicing Muslims, regular in the mosque, come back to the mosque now. And the sermons have to be in such a way that it speaks to the emotions that people are feeling, but then it gives those emotions some mobility, some sort of practical way to move with it. And so I would say that there's the spiritual resilience part, then there's the empathy part. Who is that empathy for? I would say globally for many, I'm going to specify two people. Obviously, empathy is for humanity, but two groups of people. Number one, it would be your ummah, right, which are Muslims around the world that are already facing the worst of Islamophobia in a way that you could never face it. So, for example, when Christchurch, New Zealand happened, Shadi, I'm sure you would agree with this, none of us were surprised about the attack in Christchurch. We were surprised that it happened in Christchurch. We could have totally imagined. We had armed protesters in front of our mosque constantly in Texas. There's a whole BBC documentary about the armed protesters coming to my mosque regularly, right? Holding their ARs, threatening our community. But seeing it happen in Christchurch, New Zealand, why did Christchurch? I went to Christchurch. Again, I participated in those funerals. Why did Christchurch rock our community so much? Because it looked like an American Muslim masjid. It looked like it felt like this is supposed to be one of the safe areas. And so I had to anchor that back in. Well, there are mosques getting blown up all the time. What's the difference between, Barack Obama or Donald Trump dropping a bomb on a mosque in Yemen and Syria and that happening, right? Is it because it's supposed to happen to those Muslims? It's supposed to happen to them? But it's not supposed to happen to us, because Christchurch is supposed to be safe. America is supposed to be safe. Europe's supposed to be safe. So that's one idea of leaning into the empathy towards the ummah. The second one was your American neighbors and the human beings that are around you, humanity that exists around you. And that's, I'm specifying these two populations for a reason. Right now, with everything that's happening, with the attacks of ICE on the American Muslim community, this gives us a chance to fully empathize with the terror that ICE has been wreaking on communities as a whole, the whole prison industrial complex. So we can take that empathy and we can lean into what our American neighbors and our humanity around us is feeling. So that's one way to channel that productively and say, hey, look, take this feeling that you're under attack. Say, no, there are people all around you that are under attack. And perhaps when you ignore evil, you're consumed by it, so that you can open your eyes to it. And that's part of divine wisdom and divine justice so that you become now a torch for divine justice in the world that's around you.
One more, and then I'll let Shadi get back in here. A lot of American pastors that I know are feeling very pushed, pulled, and torn politically. They have people in their congregations who don't want them to talk about politics at all. And then they have people in their congregations who very much want them to talk about politics and want them to speak about politics in exactly their way.
Yeah.
And they want their pastor to sort of use scripture and use theology to, back up their particular political agenda. So there are a lot of American pastors who are feeling pulled and pressured to speak or not speak. And I think a number of them would be interested to hear, your experience of being pushed and pulled and how you think about those things, because, the Bible is full of politics. It's full of discussions of justice and poverty and war and peace. And so to preach the Bible, it's impossible not to talk about politics if you're preaching from the Bible. And so they feel this need to speak up and say things, but they also don't want to be overly directive of, I want you to think this way about politics, or I want you to vote for this person. And so, there are these pastors who feel caught. And I'm wondering if you could speak from your own experience and your own wisdom leading your community about that kind of issue.
Yeah, I would say it's very similar. They're politically inclined Muslims love when I talk about politics, so long as my politics agrees with their politics. Then I only find objection from them the moment that I depart from their way of thinking. And so I'd say prior to October 7th, we had, and Matt, you and I sat on a panel, and I remember talking about this. We had a lot of tension because American Muslims are socially conservative, but the only embrace that was coming to them politically was from the Democratic Party. And many practicing Muslims were feeling suffocated because of their positions on abortion and other social issues. And like, is this the only way we can exist? And so the moment that I would challenge the politics of a politically minded Muslim, then suddenly I'm a villain on the pulpit. Before that, I'm the hero. You also do have, especially I'd say older Muslims who probably don't want you to talk about politics. Are like, look, we're just trying to come and have our peace in the mosque and sit and pray, and we don't want to get into this. You've got to recognize that especially immigrants, many of them came from countries where the mosque, the sermon was entirely controlled by the Ministry of Islamic Affairs in their country, what's known as the Awqaf. And so it's like, don't you dare, people would think if I talk about Trump from the pulpit, like there's going to be a police force ready to arrest me outside. That was laughable a few years ago. It's not laughable anymore because it might actually happen, right? I mean, as crazy as it sounds, right? Like, so there's definitely that tension that exists in the community. I'd say now, however, younger American Muslims, especially, are looking for answers that are based in Scripture. I would say that people are looking for the context based in the text. They don't want pure political analysis. They don't want to see their religion abused for political ends. And maybe we don't suffer from that here because our president is not pretending to be a Muslim version of a Messiah or a Muslim version. He's not pretending to be the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. God protect us all. He's been saying praise be to Allah and stuff like that mockingly. I don't know what his next off ramp is, but I think that we are less intertwined, obviously, with the dominant power structure, and so abuse of our text to fit nefarious political ends is not as imminent as it is probably for Christians, especially evangelical Christians.
Yeah, it's not as tempting.
Not as tempting. Like you get no benefit out of it.
So what advice would you give to a young imam?
Believe it or not, I actually just tell people, speak your heart. Do not show your own vulnerabilities in how you're feeling and how you're thinking. The potential, just highlight the potential gaps in your thinking. If you look at the sermon that I gave right before the election, by the way, I actually tried to do that. That, look, no one of us has a certainty about how this is going to go, and our reasoning might be totally off. But this is why we're coming to these places, and we're trying to do the right thing. And as long as we're sincere to our principles and sincere to each other, let the outcomes be decreed by God then. And we work in accordance with those outcomes when they show themselves to us. So I just tell people to be sincere and authentic, to show, not to speak about politics with a certainty or very specific political conclusions with a certainty that they might regret later on, or in a way that diminishes someone who's just as faithful as them that's coming to decisions, because this isn't a perfect situation. So people are going to make mistakes in their political calculations, but are they making those political calculations based on faith and principle and consultation, right? And if they are, then sometimes we're going to get it wrong. So just show that vulnerability. Don't be tone deaf in your own thinking.
So related to Matt's question, I often talk to younger Muslims, and they want to get involved in politics. They want to contribute to the kind of broader community, and they want to be good citizens, but they worry that if they get too involved in politics or take a position in government, that will require them to make compromises and to give up on their principles, especially if they have a position, let's say, on the national level in the State Department or Defense Department or something like that. And there were many Muslims under Biden who were in his administration who had to kind of wrestle with this question of, do we stay in and try to make things a little bit better, or do we say that we can't accept being part of an administration that is enabling a genocide? So I'm curious, I'm sure you talk to kind of young and up and coming Muslims who feel torn. And I think most of us want them to participate, but then they probably will have to make some compromises.
Yeah.
So how do you look at the line? And that line can be quite blurry in practice.
It can be quite blurry in practice. I'd say the two groups of young American Muslims that I find myself counseling more now than before are Muslims that want to get involved in politics and Muslims that work in tech. It's very consistent that in a morning prayer after Fajr, someone will pull me to the side and say, hey, I really want to talk to you. I work at this company. I don't know what to do because I know what I'm building right now. I know the tech that I'm building is being used for this, this, and that. Or, hey, I want to run for government. I want to do something about this. How do I get politically involved? So I start from the premise of, at no point, do you actually actively participate in evil or justify evil or give language to evil? This is a principle in Islam. Whoever believes in God and the last day, let them speak well or stay silent. If you can't say the truth, then at least don't speak falsehood. So you start with that. Are you going to be able to maintain your principles here? So if you are actively participating in evil or you are speaking evil in the name of job mobility or political, sufficiency, then that's not an acceptable excuse. So I would tell you to back out of that if you can't keep silent on certain things or not participate in certain things. Then it sort of becomes the second threshold, which is, can you actually say that you are actively reducing harm? Can you prove it? Can you objectively take a step back and prove that you being in that position or you saying that you're actually reducing harm and doing good? That you're going to do a better job than someone else in that situation. So it's sort of like the second threshold, and we sort of talk through that. And then third, this is an interesting exercise. What happens if you get there? Because a lot of times people start off with this framework, but then they get sucked into the system, and it becomes about either keeping your job in tech or keeping your job in politics or moving on to the next one. You've got to take into consideration all these forces that you didn't even know existed before. And when that happens, do you have a control mechanism for yourself, right? Or some sort of mechanism to revive your conscience and maintain that humility and that grounding? So I do that with folks now because we've seen many lose their way. I almost feel like, Shadi, like on politics though, like I personally, I think that it's often easier to work with a non-Muslim politician, someone who's not Muslim, but on a specific issue, because then it's like, all right, you know exactly why you're working with this person. It's clear. This is the issue. Are you going to do this or not? Are you going to are you going to participate in this evil or not? We want to know if you've earned our vote or not, if we can support you or not, if we can work with you or not. It just feels cleaner. But I understand the value of having Muslims participate as well in running for office. I think maybe it's too far of a jump that we're trying to go from like not being represented in like city councils and in local politics at all to suddenly, aiming for, federal government and these high positions that are largely symbolic, right, in many ways. I feel like we need to build a meaningful politics that's value oriented, that's not merely about representation, because that can be not just in many ways inconsequential. It can actually be even invalidating, and it can actually cause problems for the Muslim community, because we have someone that looks like us but that doesn't speak for us in any way in these places.
The other area that I think that there's a lot of tension on, and I was part of this debate last week, my last Washington Post column, I was actually arguing that Muslims shouldn't have to assimilate to belong, that they should be able to hold on to their distinctive religious and cultural traditions without becoming like everyone else, that we as Muslims are different. We're not the same as everyone else. And if you look at various surveys on this, we do practice our religion at higher rates than the overall population. Where the rest of America has become less religious, American Muslims have largely stayed steady. We pray more, we fast more. We say that religion is important in our lives at a higher rate. The list goes on. And maybe some of this is a debate over what assimilation really means, assimilation versus integration and that sort of thing. But I do think so many of us as Muslims, we kind of encounter this tension where we want to belong, we want to be part of the mainstream, but at the same time, there are things that make us different. And to what extent, I'm curious where you come out on that. And actually, Matt, if you want to jump in, because I'd be curious how you think about whether, to what extent Muslims should assimilate and that sort of thing. But I think that's one of the big questions now, especially as Republicans are attacking us and saying that we don't belong in this country. Part of us wants to say, yes, we belong. Look how assimilated we are. But then at the same time, we don't want to lose ourselves in the process.
Yeah, so I on my side of this question, because I've got my own agenda on this thing too, Dr. Omar, one of the things that Shadi and I talk about is our love and appreciation for the strangeness of our faith and actually not wanting to assimilate into the secular culture, that we do want to be distinct, and we bristle when being told that to be a good American is to assimilate into a sort of formless void of Americana. And so I am curious, obviously Muslim Americans, it's a very strong immigrant community. Many Muslim Americans were not born in the United States. And I'm curious in terms of the kinds of theological advice you give to Muslims who want to fit in, who are tempted to fit in, and how you think about what does it mean to be distinctively Muslim and American, and how you think about those calls to assimilate and to fit in.
Yeah, I would say that there are two layers to this conversation. The first one is a rights-based conversation. At what point are American Muslims worthy of just gaining the rights that are enshrined in the Constitution? And I think that that's an important conversation, an important layer to this conversation, because for both layers of what I'm going to say, it feels like we're always in probation. Like, all right, there have been no attacks this year. I think you're good now. You can come out now. Oh, wait a minute. You go back in the corner over there. We're gonna think about you now. You're not behaving right. You're not getting on board with our politics. We can't include you. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, so we're always kind of in probation, right? With the current situation, the current setup. I wrote an article called "I Am Not Your American Muslim." It was a play on Baldwin's words. I wrote this in the wake of the Muslim ban and Trump 1.0. And one of the stories that I was speaking to was something very personal. Of course, here in Dallas-Fort Worth, we had the majority of detainees in the wake of Muslim ban, which is very Texan, that we would have the majority here in Texas, particularly in Dallas. And, there was this whole story made about a detainee that almost died, whose name was Isa, Jesus, who was also an Iraq, war veteran. So it's like, this great patriot who's also named Jesus. And you had some Christians as well that were kind of like, how could we do this? A guy named Jesus, we held him. I said, that's great. I'm glad that you see the moral outrage of this. But if he was a 17-year-old Yemeni American kid, named Usama, would you still fight for his civil liberties and for his rights? So there's a rights-based layer to this that, it's sort of like with the black community. I remember when Jordan Edwards was killed, they had to say he's a 16-year-old straight A student. It's like, all right, if he was a high school dropout, does that mean that it's okay for him to be shot dead in the street? Same thing being done with immigrant communities as a whole with ICE. So that's the rights-based part. The second part of this, which is assimilation, I think that what I advocate for is principled presence, that Muslims should absolutely contribute to the common good, and they have been. Can they do more? Absolutely. Everyone can do better. And so I have to challenge my community to do better, to contribute to the common good, to love your neighbor, to give back, to use whatever prosperity you have to be a source of prosperity to everyone that's around you, to be a part of making a better America and being a part of making a better world. Absolutely, right? And that means fighting injustice and for everybody. That means standing for the good for everybody. And I would argue that if you put the American Muslim community under that magnifying glass, philanthropy and other forms of contribution to the common good, we're probably on par. We're just not on par with the symmetry, with the asymmetrical interrogation of our assimilation or our distinctiveness, that our distinctiveness seems to pose a unique threat. This is not put on any other community. And so I advocate for principled presence. I think it's deeply hypocritical to subject the American Muslim community to these demands of assimilation, unless we're moving towards a prescribed secularism model of France, which doesn't bode well. I don't think that's the type of pluralism that we want in this country. So I also relish in the idea of being the stranger. There's actually a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, be in this world as if you're a stranger or a wayfarer. So being a stranger does not mean disregarding your neighbor and not contributing to the common good and existing in your own space. It means existing as your own self in the way that you see yourself in this world and with your faith and with your values, even if the whole world around you changes. And I don't think that Muslims will be willing to alter their identity or alter their faith for these superficial embraces that come and sway with the political winds. Can I give one story here?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Something that recently happened here in Irving that I think is really powerful and instructive. It often feels like Muslims cannot have their own unique value proposition unless they're able to latch on to another community. We had a heated debate here about casinos. Mary Madelson, who is Trump's biggest donor, who's with him in the Knesset, who I have my opinions of. She's the owner of the Dallas Mavericks. She's trying to bring casinos to our community in Irving, Texas. And Muslims are obviously opposed to the presence of casinos. You could see the city council members gearing up to, spit out all of the most Islamophobic tropes that they could possibly latch onto, because that's what's been done in the past, that this is Sharia and they're trying to bring Sharia law. But once the Catholics joined us, and this became a Muslim Catholic coalition, suddenly they all backed down. And suddenly the majority of them actually got on board, because wait a minute, we can't say this is Sharia anymore because the Catholics agree with them. There was a strong Muslim Catholic coalition that was opposing the presence of these casinos in Irving now. Why is it that Muslims always have to be included with someone else in order to be taken into consideration, in order for their distinctive interventions to be acceptable in public discourse and not treated like a threat? So that's something that I would say is only unique to the Muslim community, or is unique to the Muslim community, that we're constantly subjected to that. We're not allowed to have any value propositions for harm reduction or good unless we're able to be in a coalition with someone else. Else it's Sharia law.
That is disappointing for, very clear reasons, which you outlined. But I do say there is sort of an interesting counter story, which is, when Christian colleges go to Washington, D.C. and argue for, religious freedom or their rights. My mentor, Richard Mao, he said it would always go better if the evangelicals wouldn't go by themselves, if they would bring the Catholics and the Mormons and the Muslims with them to make those requests. That there is something about a diverse, faithful coalition that seems to dispel that. It spreads out the negative and it amplifies the positive. So, if it was just the Catholics going and asking for something, or if it was just the Muslims going and asking for something, there would be that. But when you come to the government officials with a broad coalition of religious communities, there seems to be some kind of advantage.
Yeah.
And of course, each context and each issue is different. But if you have a broad form of religious communities saying, look, sports gambling is destroying our families and our communities. If it's just evangelicals doing it, we won't get very far. But if we bring other faiths with us, there seems to be something there.
I totally agree with you. I would say that the difference would be that there are significant pockets of this country where, the politicians are answerable to evangelicals, especially in Texas, right? So
yes.
Whereas, with the Muslim community, we just don't have the political currency in most places in America to be able to stand on anything on our own. We need to be in coalition. So there are times that evangelicals don't need to be in coalition and can fight it on their own. But I would argue that I agree with you. It's always better when we're able to have principled, issue-based coalitions where we stand, together for the common good, and that breaks down many of the barriers of suspicion that exist on the other issues. By the way, right? And so that's where, I've always been a proponent of that type of building, and I hope that it makes us a more functioning society at the end of the day, not just harmonious, just functioning at this point.
As we wrap up here, I want to just offer a counterpoint on the assimilation question, because it's one that I often hear directed towards me. So I'd love to get your thoughts, which is that the assimilationist model of America always wins out in the end. That we had Orthodox Jews, well, they've actually held out, but American Jews, Irish, Italians, Latinos, if you look at those groups, when you get to second, third, and fourth generation, you see quite a bit of secularization and the kind of loss of those distinctive cultural traditions, and they just start fitting in more. We're an interesting test. We're actually the first real test to see whether or not we'll be an exception to this American assimilationist model. There are some, I think, troubling signs on the horizon. I mean, one comes from the Pew Religious Landscape Study, which I was surprised at this number, that 23% of Americans who are raised Muslim leave the faith. So only about 75% stay in. That's still pretty good, but there still is this proportion that does not just assimilate, but loses any sense of being Muslim. And I think we also see that younger Muslims are more liberal on certain controversial Islamic questions. They're more pro-LGBTQ rights, more supportive of gay marriage. Part of that has to do with them being part of the Democratic Party coalition. And if you're in the Democratic Party, there's kind of a bargain there where Democrats say, we'll protect you Muslims, but in exchange, don't say too much against LGBTQ rights, for example. So some of that is maybe a little bit transactional, but I think it is fair to say that there are a lot of young Muslims who have more liberal attitudes And that's why sometimes when I'll go to Europe and I'll talk to British Muslims or European Muslims, they'll say American Muslims are kind of unique in how liberal they are. They're not as like hardcore as we are in Europe, you know? So do you have fears that the younger generation will secularize too much? And I'm curious how you think about, I don't know if you have kids, but if you do, how you think about your own kids in that regard.
Yeah. I don't know if the word is fear. I do obviously see the problems that we currently face and the ones that are on the horizon being far more severe and compromising in that sense. I do think that it's not just American Muslims that are being tested, it's the American project itself that's being tested right now, of whether or not it can bear a distinctive group of Muslims that are, again, healthily contributing to society, but very much fully in their own. I think that as we grow, it's inevitable that a significant population of our community is going to assimilate. I do think that's inevitable. But I also believe that we can sort of be a community that still maintains a critical mass of people that love their faith, that love their neighbors, that give back, but from a place of contribution based in Islam, that lean into their distinctiveness, and their distinctiveness includes surpassing others in participating in the common good and in charity and standing for justice and things of that sort, and being, open now to the realities of so many others around them. So I think that we're going to have an inevitable leak, if you will. My institution, Yaqeen, Yaqeen means certainty. We're trying to solidify certainty in the hearts of our young Muslims and maintain their uniqueness and maintain their distinctiveness in healthy ways, in ways that are uncompromising in regards to their faith, but also beautiful in terms of ethical contribution. I think we might be the community that bucks the trend. I hope that opens the doors for others as well to see that you don't have to be erased to be embraced. Right? That wasn't a bumper sticker on purpose, but you don't have to be. I mean, and so I think that there are some encouraging signs. I mean, Shadi, at the same time, you got to understand, I teach in the university setting, but I also preach from the minbar, from the pulpit. And all I see are mosques getting fuller, classes getting bigger, conferences getting bigger, that there is an excitement that exists in the American Muslim community for their Islam, wanting to learn, wanting to grow in their faith. And especially over the last few years, that disillusionment is leading directly to devotion, further devotion. So I'm encouraged by that. I think it's inevitable. Again, you're going to have a lot of people. The more generations that come, the more you're going to have that assimilation take place. But I think Muslims will probably maintain the largest critical mass of being a religious minority that still holds on at the level that we do, but in a way that's beautiful and productive. And I have 3 kids, by the way, and yes, I think about this literally every day.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, I have to ask, just as a final question, because you mentioned the importance of certainty, and Matthew and I often debate this question, and it comes up when I talk to Christians quite a bit. They're like, Shadi, when we talk to Muslims, they seem so certain in their faith. Why isn't there more doubt? Because I think Christians have a more positive view of doubt, if I can overgeneralize. And I think there is an argument for being able to share one's own doubts and vulnerabilities in that way. So I'm curious if you would maybe reflect on, is there a role for doubt in Islam? How open should we be about our doubt? Because I think there is this pressure for us Muslims that even if we question certain things, we're not supposed to say them out loud, because then other people will judge us for not having the same level of certainty that they have.
yeah, look, I mean, if speaking, the Quran constantly challenges us, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ, do you not think, do you not reason, do you not use your intellect? So it's not shutting down reason and shutting down intellect. I think that it simply teaches us to solidify our foundations and to sort of go back to the basics before we question the reasoning of our faith. Make sure we actually understand our faith before we actually get to that point. And so a lot of times, those that sort of express doubts about their Islam, about their faith, tend to come from a place of not having ever really known their faith. And so I take them back to like, do you believe in God? Do you believe in the prophets, right? Like, let's start from there. And like, do you believe that the prophets are actually prophets of God? And the Quran is the word of God. Let's sort of test that. Let's test that first. And then, if the answer is yes or no, then we go into a different trajectory, which is, are your doubts primary or secondary then? Are they trauma-based? Is there something that happened in your life that makes a particular theological position hard for you to reconcile with because of what happened to you? Are you recognizing the role that emotion has played, that your personal experiences have played in you arriving at those positions? Because we all operate with some sort of bias. We all operate with some sort of conditioning. So I just try to help people get through all of that. Obviously, I want people to stay Muslim. I want people to see the beauty of their faith. I don't want people to have doubt in their faith. But what I love about, one example that, there's some companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that had come to him and that told him that we sometimes have these things that feel unspeakable, and they hated themselves for having those thoughts and those doubts. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that it's clear faith. The fact that they hated that the doubts existed in the first place is a sign of faith. It's like, I want to get through this. Now, when I verbalize this, is it because I'm trying to throw something into the public square that's going to mess with a lot, that's going to cultivate a community of doubt? Or am I on a personal journey, and do I go to people that can help me now sort of reckon with my faith? So instead of introducing my doubts to other people, am I going through my own journey and recognizing the uniqueness of my journey and going to text and people who maybe understand text, or people that maybe understand the life experiences that I have that can help me with my journey? That's where I would say that it's important for all of us as individuals to lean into their certainty, to say, no, I believe, I want to believe, I need to work through this, and I'm not a bad person for having this doubt. God merely tasks me with acting upon it in a way that's helpful, in a way that's productive. And I find that oftentimes when people kind of get to the foundations of what led them to that place, then they're able to reckon almost with those unique positions almost on their own at that point, right? So kind of get back to the basics, solidify your faith, and then you can reckon with those other things. But before you interrogate God, interrogate yourself, interrogate your own thinking, interrogate why you may have arrived at that position.
I like that. Before you interrogate God, interrogate yourself. And, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Omar. It has been a tremendous pleasure. It's always a pleasure to wrestle with these difficult issues of faith and public life with you. And I think back on our past speaking engagements together. It's just always fantastic. And today I'm really taking away your reflections on principled participation. I do enjoy that phrase, related to my own, of principled pluralism, right? Of being deeply engaged in public, diverse life, but doing so with your convictions that you do not wish to compromise on. And so, we thank you for your leadership and your engagement and taking our questions today.
Thank you, Matt.
Really enjoyed this.
Thank you guys so much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Zealots at the Gate. If you like what you heard, check out other episodes at comment.org. Zealots at the Gate is hosted by Comment Magazine, produced by Rachel Collins. Technical production is by Ali Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy, and editorial direction by Ann Snyder.